As Bungie continued to change and refine the formula they were trying to establish with the seasonal content model, as well as their departure from Activision as a publishing label and their transition into becoming fully independent, a lot had to change with the release of Shadowkeep. As I said before, with the 3 seasons of Forsaken, those content drops were pretty substantial, and Bungie had to immediately lower expectations now that they were independent, and developing everything with a much smaller development team on the same timetable. To compensate for these downgrades, Bungie introduced a few new staples of the seasonal model, which are now ubiquitous. One of these things is the Season Pass rewards track, which is it's a battle pass. Although, to Bungie's credit, apart from a single set of armor ornaments and one single exotic weapon per season, plus an additional weapon skin, nothing was or ever has been truly locked behind this system. They're just supplemental rewards that players got in exchange for their time. And not too much time at that. Since its inception, the Season Pass has always been very easily maxed out with a playtime of only a few hours per week per season. The other big change that Bungie added starting with Shadowkeep was the seasonal artifact, and this is a much more tangible, game-changing aspect of the seasonal content model. The artifact, which changes every single season, has specific armor mods that can be unlocked in a 5x5 grid that are both build-defining and a borderline necessity for engaging with the deeper systems and tougher game modes across Destiny, particularly champions, which had been newly introduced in Shadowkeep. For the entire year, most of these artifacts would work in the following manner. Early mods would allow players to get tiny bumps to reward drops for things such as destination materials or glimmer, or they would give specific anti-champion mods to specific weapon types, and these would change season over season to encourage the use of different weapons. Later mods in the unlock tree would be enhanced, lower-cost versions of existing mods, as well as build-specific mods like the Season of Undying mods Arc Battery and Thunder Coil, which only benefited Arc-specific abilities. These kind of mods would change in later seasons to benefit different element types to encourage a healthy rotation. The idea behind all of this was, of course, to help shift the meta with each season, so that certain dominant playstyles wouldn't become too stale. This, of course, was a very deliberate and intentional way of doing so, but players have never really minded it too much. On top of that, the artifact also allowed players to passively earn additional gear score, depending on how much XP they earned throughout that given season. As some endgame activities were deliberately set at levels 20 or even 30 above the level cap, this was a way of rewarding players who leveled far beyond that with enough playtime to become stronger in those activities. The first season, and the one that launched alongside Shadowkeep on October 1st, was Season of the Undying, the very first Vex-themed piece of content since the much-maligned Curse of Osiris, and a season that actually coincided with the expansion's raid, Garden of Salvation. Season of the Undying saw Vex invasions that would take place all over the moon, sort of acting like public events that would see large waves of Vex and a very beefy boss land in a certain section of the map, and players would work together to take them down within a time limit in order to get legendary gear from a chest that dropped at the end. The main activity of the season was a Vex Offensive, a 6-player match-made activity that saw players climbing up through a section of the Black Garden, taking on waves of enemies and culminating in a boss fight at the very top. This boss was always a large Minotaur boss, until 6 weeks into the season, where the Final Assault variant of this mission was activated, and the boss was replaced with the Undying Mind Hydra enemy, the very same Undying Mind from the named strike in Destiny 1. While a somewhat fun activity with high enemy density and a good final boss fight, this activity wasn't nearly as beloved as something like the Menagerie, largely due to the fact that, well, it was the exact same thing every single run. 3 rounds with the same objectives every single time, and that was kind of it. Now, of course, the reasoning behind this lack of content was the fact that at least players got a seasonal drop at all that coincided with Shadowkeep. I mean, Shadowkeep itself is supposed to be all players are enjoying during the first 3 months anyway. Forsaken itself didn't get a seasonal content drop at all. It's only bonus content, so it's okay that Season of the Undying is a little bit barren. And what's more, 3 more exotics came alongside the seasonal drop. I said before that every season pass track had a new exotic weapon tied to it. For Undying, it was the weapon Ariana's Vow, a first-of-its-kind special ammo hand cannon that fires off powerful, accurate, and slow-firing bullets that intrinsically deal with barrier champion shields. This weapon, while honestly not super flashy beyond its high damage, was actually a meta-defining exotic and high-end PvE content for the next couple of years, and made a very good first impression. Later in the season, a quest was made active, and this led to the unlocking of another another new weapon type, a heavy ammo using bow called Leviathan's Breath. Basically a big ol' railgun that players could use to fire extremely powerful explosion-causing arrows that would stagger unstoppable champions. While it sounds great, it actually released very undertuned and wouldn't reach its full potential for a few more years. The last exotic that came with this season was the returning Monte Carlo, the harbinger of melee builds everywhere that would regenerate melee ability energy with every single bullet landed, and would occasionally straight up refresh the ability on a kill, allowing players with strong melee abilities, hello Titans, to wreak havoc with certain specific builds. Season of the Undying came to an end on December 1st, 2019, and it was followed by Season of the Dawn. Probably the community's favorite season of the entire year was in fact Season of the Dawn, which saw a legendary character once thought dead being brought back into the world of Destiny, the Doomslayer of the Destiny universe himself, Saint 14, a character we had already seen weapons and exotic armor themed around prior to this point in time. Osiris would call Guardians to action and use a special tool on Mercury known as the Sundial to put a stop to time-manipulating Scion Flayers, who were attempting to undo the loss of the Red Legion during the Red War campaign, and we had to put a stop to them. But that's not all. The sundial itself was tied to obelisks in the Tangled Shore, on Mars, in the EDZ, and on Nessus respectively, that we as players had to power up with offerings, which led to a community event known as the Empyrean Restoration. Essentially, players had to farm activities for materials known as polarized fractaline, and collectively donate more than 1 billion of the stuff to the different obelisks in order to unlock a special shader and emblem. This was an interesting idea on Bungie's part that would actually go over pretty well with the community at the time. Sundial was itself much more enjoyable than Vex Offensive and a lot closer to Menagerie in terms of enjoyability, although its reward structure was a tad more stingy. There were actually 4 different types of activities players could rotate between and multiple different end bosses that would unlock over the course of the first 3 weeks, with the final boss unlocking 8 weeks into the season. While all of this was going on, a puzzle known as the Corridors of Time was being solved and cracked by many of Destiny's most dedicated data miners and puzzle solvers. Essentially, the thing was a big maze that had thousands of different permutations that could only be understood by the many symbols that marked each room. Players had to work together to solve the path through it, and it was accessed in 2 parts. The first part saw players eventually tracking down the once dead Saint 14 in the middle of his fight with the Vex in a different part of time. With our help, he's actually able to survive this onslaught, and we're able to bring him back to our timeline alive, well, and reunited with his partner, Osiris. The second time through, we retrieved Saint's specially made weapon known as Bastion, though we'll talk about that a little bit later. Generally, all of Bungie's ideas here were received pretty well, and there's a reason why much of the community looks back on this season fondly. However, there is a fine line, as we will find out in the next season. Some tricks can only ever be played once, and Bungie would learn that with this season in a very harsh way soon enough. The Season Pass exotic for Season of the Dawn was Symmetry, an arc auto rifle with 2 firing modes, 1 hit scan and 1 a tracking projectile that could be swapped between, and landing hits with one type generally benefited the other in some way. This exotic wasn't nearly as game-changing as Ariana's Vow, and has always sat by the wayside behind much stronger arc exotics like Risk Runner, which has been in the game since Destiny 2 launched. The quest-based exotic of the season was Devil's Ruin, which was a sidearm that fired normally but with a full magazine could be changed into a single enemy melting laser beam that could be fired for a few seconds with intrinsic unstoppable champion stagger potential. And then, of course, there was Bastion, the very first and only kinetic fusion rifle that sort of behaved like a 3-burst shotgun. While initially an absolute menace in the Crucible, it was even better in PvE, as it was the only fusion rifle ever made that could achieve critical damage on enemy weak spots, making it a very high damage option until this aspect of the gun was later changed in a future season. Season of the Dawn would come to an end on March 9th, 2020, and was succeeded by Season of the Worthy. Possibly due in part to the fact that a world-shattering pandemic was taking place, and an already very dedicated player base full of no-lifers had even more time on their hands, as well as possibly due to the fact that what was on offer was inferior to the previous season in every single way. Season of the Worthy was very heavily criticized for stripping down a lot of what had been working in the seasonal model up to this point, down to its barest essentials, and was generally considered the lowest point Destiny had been in since before the launch of Forsaken. Season of the Worthy sees Warmind expansion subject Anna Bray working with Commander Zavala to put down the last holdouts of the Red Legion aboard the Almighty, the star-destroying superweapon from the Red War campaign. But these stragglers have put the Almighty on a collision course with the Last City. The solution? reactivate the Warmind again, and hope that he can knock it out of the sky. To do so, Guardians would be tasked with traversing across the system to different Seraph bunkers in order to activate and give control of them back to the Warmind in order to power up and supplement his systems. On top of this, rather than a match-made activity this time, a public event called Seraph Tower was made the repeatable activity of the season, and boy did this not go over well with players. Now, to be fair, Season of the Worthy did introduce one very new and different something to the game, and that was a new type of combat mod known as Warmind cells. Certain weapons earned during this season could spawn these bright orange balls of energy, and the mods would allow players to utilize them in certain ways. Far and away the most famous and utilized mod was Global Reach, which essentially made these cells a total nuke that would blow up every enemy in its vicinity with massive damage when shot by certain Warmind-centric weapons. These mods would be so strong that they would all but define the meta for the next year or so until Bungie nerfed them into the ground and eventually did away with the combat mod system altogether. The other criticisms of this season included the unlock grid for the Seraph bunkers, which was almost one-to-one the same as the upgrades for the obelisks in Season of the Dawn. And there was another community event called The Lie that required players to collectively complete the Seraph Tower 3 million times in total, and with a much bigger reward leading into an entire weapon quest for the returning Fellwinter's Lie shotgun, an infamous PvP-centric weapon from the vanilla Destiny 1 days, back when shotguns could get the absolutely broken perk known as Shot Package, which tightened pellet spreads, allowing them to one-shot kill from insane ranges. This whole event was so maligned and so unpopular that Bungie was forced to lower the requirements significantly for players to even have a chance of achieving it, as by this point, Destiny's player base had shrunken significantly this late into the season. The exotic from the season pass was Tommy's Matchbook, a Tommy gun-inspired solar auto rifle that would increase in damage with sustained fire, but also damage players as it reached these thresholds, leading to specific heal-centric builds that would be required to make this weapon work. But the reward for doing so was high, as Tommy's Matchbook has always been an excellent weapon to those who are willing to put the effort into it. The quest exotic for this season was the returning Fourth Horseman, a high-damage burst shotgun from Destiny 1 that would unload its entire package in under a second. A good weapon for making sure high-health targets died immediately. While Fellwinter's Lie itself is not an exotic weapon, its significance and legendary status among Destiny players meant that it was sort of treated as the third exotic weapon of the season, and thus there weren't any others. Season of the Worthy culminated in a season-ending event that players could watch from the tower, as the Almighty would be shot out of the sky, just narrowly missing the last city in its descent and instead crashing into a nearby mountain range, just barely nicking the tower on the way down. Season of the Worthy would come to an end on June 9th and would be followed up by the Season of Arrivals. As this Season of the Worthy wasn't unpopular enough, during the middle of the season, Bungie announced that they would be sunsetting certain older weapons and armor with the release of the next expansion, as well as vaulting certain lesser-used gameplay spaces. The reasoning behind the former was that players had too many toys to play with, and many weapons were just too dominant in the sandbox due to their insane power. This was particularly the case with pinnacle weapons, certain game mode-specific weapons locked behind certain requirements, like the competitive playlist in the Crucible, that gave players legendary weapons that were just about as good as, if not better than, exotics. The reasoning behind the latter? File sizes. Yeah. Bungie said that the game's too bloated and that the bloat was causing a lot of technical issues behind the scenes, and let's just say that Bungie didn't just attract the ire of Destiny players, but much of the gaming community as a whole, as removing paid content from your video game is never going to go over well. But before all of this took effect, Bungie had a season ready to go that would essentially give us an in-game reason for the vaulting, and that was the Season of Arrivals. Except the next expansion was also delayed by a couple of months, and so this season would have to keep players sated and happy for 5 entire months. Would it pull it off? Well, sort of yes, actually. The pyramid ships from that mysterious foreshadowing cutscene from the end of the Red War campaign have made it to our system, and they've taken route over Titan, Io, Mars, and Mercury. Eris has a plan, and it involves the Tree of Silver Wings, the root of the Traveler's Light on Io that gave us our new supers back during the Forsaken campaign. This time, Guardians are given actual story missions that change week over week, all involving the tree and actually expanding the story, making this the first season not to rely on match-made content to advance its its plot. The interference mission was fun, tough, and with Erismore narrating the way, it became increasingly ominous and engaging. There was also a public event called Contact rather than a match-made activity, but this one was a lot more interesting and exciting than Seraph Tower. For one, it differed heavily between the 4 zones it took place on and could even vary within the zone depending on where it took place. These were long combat-heavy affairs that differed in objectives with each round and gave players quite a bit of loot, as well as umbral engrams, which alone probably went the furthest way in keeping players hooked for the entire 5 months of the season. Umbral engrams could be brought to a machine near the drifter in the tower and could be focused into specific weapons and armor. Bonuses earned throughout the season could be used to enhance this focusing process and actually made better and or more specific, allowing anyone who played throughout the season to get the weapons they wanted as well as high stat armor, all in preparation for the upcoming expansion, as the cutoff for sunset weapons and armor was Season of the Worthy. Anything earned before that was what would be rendered unusable going into Beyond Light. On top of all of this, the first dungeon released apart from an expansion came in the form of Prophecy, a visually stunning experience inside the Realm of the Nine that utilized the moat gathering mechanics of Gambit and the Contact public event in a very different and unique way. The Season Pass exotic was Witherhorde, a kinetic breach-loading grenade launcher that would leave pools of Taken energy on the ground that would damage anything inside of it, and could whittle down an enemy's health very quickly if they were hit directly by the blast instead. This exotic was so strong that it practically took over the meta for years until it was eventually nerfed. The only thing it wasn't good at was boss DPS, but even that it was good at from a supplemental standpoint. The quest exotic of this season was Ruinous Effigy, a trace rifle that would turn defeated enemies into a ball of void energy. This ball could then be picked up and either dunked for massive damage or used as an AoE orb of energy sapping void energy that could damage all enemies within its radius and heal the user as a result, making for another stupidly powerful weapon that also eventually got nerfed, although much sooner than Witherhorde. The final exotic of the season was Traveler's Chosen, a sidearm that would give players ability energy based on the number of enemies killed with the weapon before reloading, although its bullets didn't actually do anything any regular sidearm couldn't, leading it to be an overall pretty underwhelming exotic by the end of its initial run. Season of Arrivals really did a lot to soften the many blows that players were bracing for with both sunsetting and vaulting, and actually managed to keep players engaged for most of its extended runtime, really delaying a lot of players' gripes that wouldn't manifest in full until well into the life cycle of the next expansion. If it weren't for the multitude of fears for the future that hung over this season as a whole, Season of Arrivals would likely be considered the best that this year had to offer. Much like Age of Triumph back in Destiny 1, there was something about this season that felt like a last hurrah, and it showered players with loot and enjoyable things to do as a new beginning waited on the horizon. While a lot of negativity did surround this season, much of what this season did right lasted in players' minds for far longer and defines its legacy much more so. The season would come to an end with another big cutscene event, where the 4 locations of the season, Titan, Io, Mercury, and Mars, would be engulfed by the darkness from the ships, and thus their disappearance from the destination's map. Season of Arrivals came to an end on November 9th, 2020, in order to make way for the upcoming expansion, Beyond Light. The Seasons of Shadowkeep are overall probably the least beloved set of 4, as this was a pretty tough time in Destiny, one that wouldn't be felt again until Lightfall. From pretty much the beginning of Season of the Worthy all the way through Season of the Hunt, which released during Beyond Light, community sentiment was rapidly approaching an all-time low that nearly rivaled the darkest hour in Destiny's history, Curse of Osiris. But we have one more seasonal recap to go over once we reach the end of Beyond Light in this Let's Play, and you'll see how Bungie just tweaked the ideas enough to make the seasonal model soar once again, and carry the game into yet another high point, as Destiny would reach its apex all over again with Witch Queen. But as far as this video goes, that's all I have to say. Thank you all so very much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.